I want to talk about one other boundary, and that's the biodiversity one, to give you a flavor of something that is very, very tough to set. All right, we all know what biodiversity is, or most of us know what biodiversity is. We've seen some examples on the slideshow as we came into the room. Beautiful images of creatures from around the world, marine creatures, terrestrial creatures, and so on. And we're used to that. We like these charismatic creatures. This is one from Australia, in fact. But biodiversity is much more than that. This is an example not far from here. This is southern China. Now, what has happened here? Well, there have been some problems with the ecosystem such that the species of bees that pollinate this fruit tree plant have disappeared due to degradation of the ecosystem. An ecosystem service was lost. Humans now have to take over that function. So these are people having to crawl up the tree and manually pollinate those blooms so that they can get fruit. So biodiversity is more than charismatic creatures. It provides services for us, as Johan mentioned, and that's a good example. We can look at the Earth's past over hundreds of millions of years, and we see periods where there are abrupt losses of biodiversity. So this has happened before in the past. But it takes a long time in terms of hundreds of thousands, several million years for the biodiversity to recover, for evolution to come back. So the pattern is a very abrupt drop in biodiversity and then a slow recovery. Abrupt drop, slow recovery. This latest one here, about 65 million years ago, was the famous one that knocked the dinosaurs out. Often these are due to abrupt changes in the Earth system, a large meteor striking the Earth, or perhaps multiple volcanoes erupting in very close succession. So we've seen this before. But now, from our point of view, we're facing the sixth mass extinction event. It's caused mainly by us. But what does it mean? First of all, we need to know what's the relationship between global biodiversity and Earth system functioning. Does it matter that we lose this diversity? Does it matter at local scale? Well, it does. But does it matter at the global scale? How much of the Earth's resilience is underpinned by the fact that we have a very diverse biological fabric that does a lot of things? How do we define the envelope of natural variability in the Holocene? We can do it for climate. We have good records from ice cores. We can do it for CO2 because we know how CO2 is varied through the Holocene. We can do it for ocean acidity. But how do we define a natural envelope for biodiversity? Zero species loss? That might be a bit severe. How much can we tolerate? How much would define going significantly outside of that envelope? This is a question that biodiversity researchers haven't been asked before. So we're struggling with how we might answer that question. And what aspects of biodiversity are important for ecosystem functioning? At what scales? Is it the number of species? Or is it their distribution? Or is it their interaction? And so on. These are really tough questions. This system of biological interactions and services is at least as complex as the climate system, and it's much less studied. All right, there's some pretty pictures of biodiversity. What sits behind that are all the functions, all the services that make life possible for you and for me. Nearly all of them are not even in any economic equation. They're never considered when cost-benefit analysis are done. And yet we cannot survive without them. So here are a few of them. These are the ones we actually know about. They provide goods for us. Food, timber, that's pretty obvious. And those are in economies. But water often isn't. Pure water, potable water, and sufficient quantities to support a growing number of people. Medicines and so on. We're increasingly getting those from biological organisms. But there are many other things that they do for us in terms of services. They have regulating services. I talked about pollination. We lose a pollinator, we have big problems. But also air quality. They filter materials out of air and cleanse the air. Carbon sequestration. We're increasingly talking about that, and we're perhaps talking about putting a value on that so it comes into an economy. Biological control, really important. We see that in Australia when we lose biodiversity in birds and we get an outbreak of locusts which hit our wheat crop. Okay? No one factored in the economy the value of those birds in controlling other species. And habitats and so on. And importantly, recreation and inspiration. Our lives would be greatly diminished with a large diminution of biodiversity. Okay, so how are we going to set a boundary for this? Well, our first attempt was based on species extinction as the indicator, as the control variable for biodiversity. And we followed the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which estimates that already from the distant past, the fossil record, we have increased the rate of species extinction by a factor of about 100. So species are disappearing 100 times faster than the natural background rate. And I should add, this is before climate change is having a major impact. This is mainly due to habitat change, invasive species, and changes in disturbance regimes, and direct human predation, fishing, hunting, and so on. But when climate change starts kicking in really seriously this century, we're predicting perhaps another 100-fold increase. So we will definitely be in the 6th major extinction event. This is a very big number. 10 to 30% of mammal, bird, and amphibian species are currently threatened with extinction. And we have a reasonable degree of certainty with that. That's a frightening number. Frightening, too, because we don't know what the implications of this are for the functioning of the planet, at the Earth system scale all the way down to local scales. This has been criticized. We've had more comments probably on this boundary than we have on any other boundary. And a lot of them have been critical, saying this is far too simple. People who understand biodiversity say you need to think more carefully. Well, here's another example of what we could do. We could define a different control variable. This one happens to be mean species abundance. That's not the same thing as species extinctions. This recognizes that as species ranges contract, they contract to a point where they are no longer functionally significant, and they do not play their role in the ecosystems they used to play before they go extinct. So in terms of function, this may be a better indicator than species extinction. We've made some estimates, again, from pre-industrial down to the present, and it's interesting, you can do this by biome. You see the biomes over there. Two things strike you. Just like the Arctic sea ice, just like the Greenland ice sheet, just like aspects of the climate system, we start to see an acceleration somewhere between 1900 and 1950 and a big drop-off as we project into the future. It's the same shape of curve as we've seen before. The second thing is we are losing most of that biodiversity, most of that species abundance from medium and high productivity ecosystems. The ones that have been less affected are the low productivity ecosystems. Are we getting a disproportionate effect on functioning? We don't know. So let me close by saying we've got to do some more work on the biodiversity boundary. And here's some of our questions. Do we have the right control variable? Should it be species extinction rate? It's easy for people to understand conceptually, but is something like mean species abundance actually a more accurate or a more telling control variable? We have to define the range of natural variability during the Holocene. What actually takes us out of the Holocene world, the Holocene pattern of variability in terms of biodiversity? We don't know. We don't have a good idea. And of course, the big one, what's the relationship between diversity, ecosystem functioning, and the services that we depend on? Again, we don't have a good handle on that. I'll just close then with, again, contrasting these two. Some of the boundaries, some of the geophysical, some of the physical-chemical boundaries are much easier to define than these ecosystem or system-level boundaries. Nevertheless, we think this could be just as important as some of the big geophysical boundaries that we're pushing this century. I'll leave it at there, and if you have questions, we can deal with those during discussion. Thank you very much.